Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. We're pleased to welcome today Juan Cole, who is professor of history at the University of Michigan. He's the author of many books and articles on Islam, including Sacred Space and Holy War, and Modernity and Millennium. His blog, InformedComment.com, covers the Middle East and has played an important role in informing the public about the Middle East and the Iraq War and the consequences of that war. Professor Cole, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you very much.
Where did you do your undergraduate? Graduate work you did at undergraduate first. And
well, my undergraduate work I did at Northwestern. Mm-hmm. In fact, I went to Northwestern because I had a dear friend when we were stationed in Asmara in Eritrea, who was a couple years older than I, and he had gone to Northwestern, and we had kept in touch. We corresponded. We had many of the same interests, and so he encouraged me to apply there. Otherwise, I might not, being from, my family settled ultimately in Northern Virginia, so I might not have known much about the Chicago area, but I applied there on his recommendation, as well as a number of other places, and Northwestern was very generous to me, and so I really felt I should go there. And
then on to Columbia for graduate work in history?
No, I was UCLA.
UCLA, okay, UCLA.
Well, actually, there's an in-between. I finished at Northwestern in 1975. I had an opportunity my senior year to spend 2 quarters abroad on a scholarship, and I was able to design a project that would take me wherever I liked. And we had stopped off in Beirut in 1968 on the way back from Eritrea, and I had fallen in love with the place. And so I spent 2 quarters of my senior year doing a research project in Beirut while at Northwestern. And then I graduated, and I came back to Beirut in the fall of '75 in hopes of doing an MA at the American University in Beirut on Shiite Islam. That was my plan. And the Civil War interposed itself, and I was displaced from there and went to Jordan, and ultimately did the degree instead in Cairo at the American University in Cairo. I came back to Beirut for a year, and then it became clear to me that Lebanon was just not going to be a hospitable place to foreigners. And I was working in Beirut in '78, '79 for a newspaper, doing more translation really than journalism proper, but it got some of the printer's ink in my blood, and taught me how to read quickly and to distill information, to put things in an inverted pyramid form, and to work under pressure. Often my editor would give me a story to translate and research, and I'd have to have it back to him in 2 hours, and so forth. And I would do that from 6 in the evening till 12 midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning. There in Beirut. Sometimes the Syrians and the Maronites would fight, and the electricity would be knocked out, and we wouldn't know whether we'd be able to get the paper out the next morning or not, so we were finishing it up by hand and candlelight in case the electricity would come back on. So that experience in Beirut, where I was off and on between '75 and spring of '79, was very formative for me. I lived through the beginnings of that civil war. I had been there also in the summer of '77. Then I went on to UCLA in '79, and by that time the Iranian Revolution had happened. And so I wanted to do my dissertation on Shiite Islam in Iran if I could, and sort of the roots of the power of the clergy. Nowadays, it's no longer perhaps shocking to people that the Shiite clergy rule Iran. However, in 1978, no one was expecting that to happen. The Shah seemed perhaps a little shaky on his throne, but and the country could have gone in a number of directions. But clerical rules was something that was not in any observer's mind, I think. However, because of the hostage crisis, I was unable to go to Iran and wanted to work on Shiism, and I wanted to do field work because the subject was under-researched. I don't think it was a good subject for a library dissertation at that time. And so I wanted to go out into the field, but southern Lebanon was in flames. Iraq was under the Ba'ath government anyway, was fighting a war with Iran and wasn't a particularly appealing or safe place. Probably couldn't have gotten a research visa for this subject there. And if you went through the Shiite countries, they were just all closed to me. But I discovered from doing some manuscript research that there were lots of Arabic and Persian manuscripts in India and Pakistan from the 18th and 19th century that would help to explore the development of Shiite thought and institutions in that age. There was in fact a Shiite-ruled kingdom in northern India between the fall of the Mughal Empire and the rise of the British. So that's what led me to South Asia.
You raised some interesting points, and one of the things that is remarkably achieved in your blog, which we'll talk about later, is this reconciling the tension between the work of journalism, which you've just told us you did, and the work of the academy. Reflect a little on that. I mean, most often people don't do both well. They either do one or the other. What in your background or your training or your genes has empowered you to do that so well?
Well, I think it was the background that I had. You know, of course, in high school sometimes worked on the school newspaper. I did that in Eritrea, actually. But that experience that I had in Beirut, where I was working for a newspaper, was good training. If you do something like that 6 or 7 hours a day, every day for almost a year, it really trains you in certain habits of thought. I think with journalism, there are a number of essential things that one has to be careful about. Sourcing. Good journalism, you know, you want to have more than one source, preferably 3, and not from all the same group. I think a lot of bloggers get caught up in errors because of depending on a single source. Now, if you only have a single source and there's no way to get any other sources, and you have what you think is an important story, then I think if you can find ways of verifying other than other sources, it might still be possible to go forward, but I think you should also signal to your readers that it's single source. And then just quickness, just being able to see the material, put it together in your mind, figure out how to tell that story, and write it up in a quick way. A lot of people just don't have those habits of thought, and it's very difficult for them. It would drive a perfectionist crazy to have to just have this stuff out all of a sudden. I think also, however, I should say that I don't do very much of what I think of as news gathering. Journalism has 2 major parts: news gathering and commentary, which was jokingly called punditry, which is actually from a Sanskrit word. The pundits were were a class of religious specialists originally who gave forth religious opinions. The professoriate has all along been an important part of commentary in the press, and in that regard, I don't think I'm doing anything particularly new or different. I'm writing what are essentially opinion pieces. The big difference is that in the old days, you had to get your opinion pieces past a gatekeeper. And I found that the gatekeepers at the major newspapers, I had a sense, sometimes I would call them about a piece that I'd submitted, in a sense that they were very suspicious of academics. They began with a conviction, I think that's common among journalists, that academics can't write straight. That it's a little, that they're obscure, that they'll put the audience off, or they won't be able to communicate well. And while there are certainly academics who write in a convoluted manner, most academics have to teach 18-year-olds, and they have to make their subject clear to them. And so in lecturing, academics are communicating to a general public all the time. So I think the journalists have a little bit of a prejudice there, and getting past that prejudice is really difficult, because then they don't look at your piece seriously. You can't get it out of the slush pile. And the wonderful thing about blogging was that I could just demonstrate that I could write. And the journalists and the editors began reading my blog, and some of them thought well of my writing. And then they would invite me to write op-eds. I discovered that it's much better when the editor invites you to write the op-ed.
So in a way, and we should mention to our audience, and we will in the transcript put the link to your blog, which is called informedcomment.com, or it can also be reached.
It's just Informed Comment.
Informed Comment. Oh, okay. Informed Comment. Okay. Or Juan Cole.
JuanCole.com. JuanCole.com.
Yeah. And it emerged, I think, a year after the attack at 9/11, or what year?
Just 6 months.
Yeah, just 6 months afterward, and it has become an extraordinary global nodal point for information about the Middle East, but especially about the Iraq War. And I want to talk about that, but I want to pursue something, because I want this to also keep in the back of our minds the background and history, because I read recently somewhere where you said that Deputy Secretary of Defense Wolfowitz, before the Iraq War, had saw only the secular side of Iraq, and that had no sense of what the religious impact would be once we invaded Iraq. So you, when you started this blog, probably was one of the world's experts, great experts on the Shia religion. So you were able to bring the history that you had been working on, the books that you had written, to help analyze and comprehend in a way that our leaders definitely were not, and maybe also the news media generally.
Yeah, I have to say that it only gradually became apparent to me that the Washington power elite had no idea what it was talking about when it came to Iraq. And as this became apparent to me, I became extremely alarmed. I wrote a piece for our International Institute, and I was asked to write about the pros and cons of the war. And among the cons I mentioned was that the Shiites of Iraq would certainly make an alliance with the Ayatollahs in Tehran, and moreover that if you overthrew Ba'athist Sunni Arab secular nationalism and discredited it, likely the Sunni Arabs in Iraq would adopt a point of view closer to that of al-Qaeda. And we had seen this in Egypt. It was the 1967 war in which Abdel Nasser, the great champion of secular Arab nationalism, was so humiliated by Israel. It was in the wake of that you had a big movement in Egypt towards Islamic revivalism, and indeed Al-Jihad al-Islami of Ayman al-Zawahiri has its origins in that period. So I expected a religious revival in a post-Saddam Iraq, and when I heard Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz on NPR in February of 2003 asserting that the Shia of Iraq were secular, and that there wasn't a problem of U.S. troops defiling holy cities in Iraq, I was floored. I was just very alarmed. I thought they really have no idea, do they?
One of the problems that one has to think about when one looks at the broader picture of the Middle East and our involvement in the Middle East is this whole question, which you have addressed, especially in the two books that I have here, Sacred Space and Holy War. Let me hold it up for 1 second. And Modernity and the Millennium. Is this question of the interface between Islam in the Middle East and what we think of as modernity. Address that question a little, because there is a perception that the Middle East has remained medieval, when in fact I think what you're arguing is that that reflects a lack of insight into the complexity of the way actors in the region respond to the elements of modernity.
Yes, well, you know, the 19th century sociologist Auguste Comte put forward a stage theory of human history, and he located the theological stage in the medieval. And so it's been a tendency of Western observers ever since to see highly religious societies as still stuck in a previous stage. But of course, social science has developed since Comte, and we now no longer think that religion equals medieval. And if you think about it, the Solidarity movement in Poland and the role of the Pope in ending communism there was a very modern phenomenon involving dock workers and modern kinds of institutions and in communications. The Khomeini movement in Iran depended on audio cassettes and the BBC broadcasts, and was influenced by the Algerian Revolution and the thinking of the left bank intellectuals in Paris, as well as by Shiite thought. So these movements of religious movements in the contemporary world are not medieval, even though observers tend to code them that way. And they, to the extent that they hearken back to medieval themes, they often misrepresent the medieval. For instance, in medieval times, governments were not very powerful, and they would really, you know, sort of come around once a year to collect taxes, and then you wouldn't hear from them very much besides that. They weren't in people's lives the way government is today. And so the idea of an Islamic state, such as now has been instituted in Iran, no, we don't know about anything like that in the medieval period. They had kings and potentates and principalities, just like Europe did, and there was no such thing as an Islamic state. Occasionally, you could maybe have small theocratic entities, but for the most part, they were just kingdoms and empires. So the religious revivalists, both in the Western world and in the Middle East, in their own minds, create an ideal medieval period to which they often hearken back. But they're not medieval, they're modern. And modernity is a whole set of experiences, modes, themes that has transformed the world in the past more than 2 centuries, and which has been felt as alienating everywhere. I mean, it's often forgotten. I would say, you know, Germany has had enormous difficulties with modernity. I mean, I think you see it in the Romantic movement and Hegel and the disillusionment with Napoleon and the authoritarianism of the Bismarck period and how to deal with trade unions and so forth. And then, of course, the whole National Socialist tragedy. I don't think that modernity has come easily to the Germans, and neither has it come easily to many in the Middle East. But this is not peculiar in modern history.
You at one point in one of your books, you comment that it can be said that, I'm paraphrasing now, modernity hasn't generally, although there were these experiments in modernity, these different histories than the one we traditionally look at, that on the whole there has been a failing for modernity to take hold in the way that it did in the West. If that's fair, if that's a fair statement of your belief, then what do you see as the primary factors accounting for this? Was it Western imperialism? Has it in recent times been oil? Are there factors that we can identify that help us understand these particular failures in the Middle East?
Well, I should be careful in saying that I was talking about a handful of themes in modernity with regard to the rise of popular sovereignty and parliamentary governance, for instance, conceptions of individual rights, the women's movement, a whole range of these things, and coming to terms with the separation of religion and state. And of course, all of these themes are challenging and have been challenging, and this is my point, to all of the societies in the world. So for instance, the Swiss women didn't get the vote at a federal level until 1971, and there were some cantons where it was later. And French women didn't get the vote until 1945. So when the Middle East is criticized for, Saudi Arabia, for instance, still does not have the vote for women. But the Iranian women have had the vote since the 1960s, and that's true in a number of other Middle Eastern countries. So it's not that far from 1945 to the 1960s. I mean, the difference in that regard is not so very great. And we're talking about what is thought of as an advanced country like France. But with regard to parliamentary rule, really only Turkey among the Muslim Middle East societies has come close to having a fairly steady parliamentary regime, although it's been punctuated by military coups from time to time. The fact that Turkey joined NATO, I think, helped to put pressure on its military always to go back to the barracks in the end. Now that it wants to join the European Union, there's been pressure on it to liberalize on human rights issues and so forth. But there aren't any parliamentary regimes in the Middle East besides Turkey that come close to meeting international standards. Of course, the Americans hope that Iraq eventually will. But I'm accepting Israel because its origins really are mostly from outside the region. And you ask, why? Why should that be? That we don't have more parliamentary regimes in the Middle East? Of course, they were rare in East Asia, Southeast Asia, for much of the 20th century as well. Korea only fairly recently has gone in that direction, and South Korea, and China still has not, and so forth. So the question of the political evolution of these countries is a very complex one, but one could point at certain things. For instance, and I do think that Western influence has been both a hindrance and a help in the direction of these societies. Iran, after World War II, had a period of relatively lively parliamentary life. And a nationalist prime minister was elected who ultimately came into conflict with the British over the royalties the British were receiving from Iranian petroleum, which the Iranians felt were no longer sufficient. And the Iranians wanted to renegotiate the deal and get a better share of oil income. And the British absolutely refused and wouldn't negotiate. And so the prime minister of the time, Mosaddegh, nationalized Iranian petroleum. The United States and Britain led an international boycott of Iranian petroleum, which was quite debilitating for the Mosaddegh government, and ultimately the MI6, the British intelligence, came up with a plan to overthrow Mosaddegh, which it couldn't implement because the British had all been kicked out of Iran, but which it passed to the CIA, and ultimately the CIA carried out this plan. At the time, the Eisenhower administration was convinced that Mosaddegh was leaning towards the communists. This was not true, but in any case, the parliamentary experiment in Iran ended because the Americans ended it, and they brought the Shah back and put him on the throne as an absolute monarch. So you have the United States, which fought a 7-year war against George III to end absolute monarchy on this continent, actually imposed absolute monarchy on Iran, and it is certainly the case that in trying to impose it, they created an unstable situation which eventuated in the Iranian Revolution. So I don't think that in every instance authoritarianism in the Middle East can be explained by external intervention, but there's been a lot of external intervention, and it usually hasn't been helpful to human rights or political freedom. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan. They were very influential in South Yemen. There are persistent allegations, and we historians haven't seen the documents yet, so we don't know if they're true, but there are persistent allegations that the United States helped to engineer the 1963 and 1968 Ba'ath coups in Iraq because it was alarmed at rising communist influence. So certainly external interventions of various sorts have been unhelpful. I argue in one of my books that in 1882, in the 19th century, a parliamentary movement arose in Egypt, which the British intervened to stop because they were afraid it would threaten their various economic interests in the region. That's one, but then there are lots of other factors. You know, a lot of political scientists are convinced that parliamentary rule is helped by a certain amount of affluence in society, that there's kind of $8,000 a year per capita it's not an absolute necessity, but because India obviously is an exception. But on the whole and by and large, that seems to be the current level of support that one needs for a parliamentary regime. And if you think about it, part of what's going on in a democracy is that the people are strong against the government. Mm-hmm. The government can't just walk all over them. There are constituencies that are able to influence the government in various ways, lobbying and pressure points and so forth. So the wealthier the society is, the more likely it's able to strike a better bargain with the government. It has more resources vis-a-vis the state. So the Middle East, aside from the oil states, which are small mostly and somewhat peculiar, Middle East is a very poor place. Morocco, Egypt, Algeria, Syria, they're simply not wealthy societies. Mm-hmm. So the societies in that regard, with regard to resources, are often weak vis-a-vis the state.
But it's clear that, as you suggested earlier, that what cannot be ignored are the religious currents that sort of are a foundation of all of these societies throughout the region. That then leads to the importance of this question of the separation of church and state, which we achieved apparently, you know, in the West, although again this is subject to cycles as we're now sort of seeing. Talk a little about that in relation to Iran and Iraq, because you, as somebody who's quite knowledgeable and had done much research on Iran, were able to point out in your book that Khomeini was a distinctive, in quotes, modern definition of the relationship of the religion to the state, and it would be one that might not necessarily be repeated in Iraq, one could assume. Talk a little about that tension and the possibility, how it helps us understand outcomes and the possibilities for achieving this breakthrough with regard to popular sovereignty, even in the context of societies where religion is so important.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure that religion is more important to most people in the Middle East than it is, say, to most Americans. But I think it does play a different role in politics. And I think it does have to do with the legacy of colonialism and then the current situation in which most of these countries are small and weak and tend to be dominated by the European powers, by the United States. I see the religious themes in the Middle East really as a form of nativism, as a claim on an indigenous identity. If one is an Egyptian and living in the early 20th century under British rule, so that Lord Cromer is making laws for you and deciding about your life when you never elected Lord Cromer and maybe don't even approve of him, then if you want to assert yourself as an Egyptian and to say that there's a real Egyptian identity that's different from the British and which is authentic and which has claims for ordering Egypt that are superior to the claims of British colonialism, then what makes Egyptians distinctive? Well, one of the things is that they are Sunni Muslims, and so appealing to Islam as an anti-imperial or anti-colonial theme is a natural thing to do. And I don't think it's so hard to imagine that if a foreign country, a non-Christian country, were ruling California or Alabama or Michigan, I think you would find that religious groups who defined America as a Christian nation might make certain claims in that regard and organize to try to get rid of the foreigners. So I would argue that the salience of religion in the Middle East does have something serious to do with colonialism and neo-imperialism. That it's a form of nativist politics. And it's not the only form of nativist politics that's in the area. You've had more or less fascist movements in the Middle East. There's such a party, an ultra-nationalist party in Turkey. There was a Young Egypt party, which was relatively secular, but Egyptian nationalist in the 1930s, which modeled itself, I think, on the fascist groups, not so much the Nazis, but say Mussolini and Franco. You even have that among the Lebanese Christians, the Maronites in Lebanon in the 1970s. Many of them joined the Phalangist Party, which was explicitly modeled on Franco and Mussolini. And that's not a religious sort of phenomenon. So it's a different kind of nativism. Those, what I'm calling fascist parties, would appeal to ancient symbols, to the cedars of Lebanon or to the Phoenicians, or in Egypt, there was a cult of the ancient pharaonic civilization. So the non-religious people who wanted to assert nativism would find other bases for doing it. But in Iran, because of the overthrow of Mosaddegh by the United States and the close alliance the Shah had with the United States as an imperial power, I think Shiite Islam, which is distinctive to Iran and a very important part of Iranian national identity in the modern period, and going back to the 1500s, it's been part of Iranian life in a big way. The emphasis on Shiite Islam is again, a kind of nativist reassertion of local identity and local forms of polity, local law, local custom against the imperial impact. And so I don't think most Iranians in 1978 were all that religious. And I don't think most of the people who made the revolution envisaged that it was a revolution for clerical rule. And once the clerics got into power, they had to struggle mightily to stay there. They killed 10,000 guerrillas of the Mujahideen movement, and they had to round up a lot of other people and threaten them or kill them. And So it was a case where the revolution was hijacked by the clerics, and then they imposed a certain kind of rule in Iran, which ultimately wasn't very popular. I mean, we think that in most elections, if the Iranian people had their say, the hardline religious groups wouldn't get more than 15% of the vote. So, you know, Iranian middle class and youth are quite rebellious with regard to the religious puritanism that has been a keynote of the Iranian state. Every once in a while you see notices in the Iranian press about how a nefarious internet dating group has been busted up. At parties and middle-class parties in places like Tehran, the hosts are considered cheap if they don't serve liquor, which is forbidden in Islam. In some places, in towns over near Afghanistan, apparently the host is expected to supply some heroin because the poppies are nearby and so forth. So there's a lot of drug addiction, there's alcohol abuse, there's prostitution. Iran represents itself as a religious state, but its society is beset by many moral problems, and there seems to be an enormous disaffection among the youth towards religion and towards the regime.
So you're suggesting that as an intervention has an unintended consequence, which is to, in a way, provoke or empower the very forces that ideally we would not favor in that region.
Well, I'd nuance it a little bit by saying that in the early 50s, when the United States overthrew the democratically elected government of Iran, the main reason for doing it, and the main fear driving Washington at the time, was a fear of the Communist Party in Iran, the Tudeh party. And Mosaddegh, the nationalist prime minister who was overthrown, led a coalition, a broad-based movement that had several wings. He represented kind of the educated middle class, I think, and was, if anything, right of center. In fact, he was an aristocrat, descended from nobles of the Qajar dynasty. But he did allow the Iranian Communist Party into his coalition as the left wing of it. And he also allowed Ayatollah Khashoggi into his coalition as the right wing of it, as the religious wing. There are firm indications in U.S. diplomatic documents that out in the countryside, U.S. diplomats and aid workers and others were actively encouraging the Shiite right as a way of offsetting the communists. And I think you would...
like Israel.
Yes, well, but I think the Israeli policy of encouraging Hamas in the late 1970s and through the 80s is not a newly invented strategy. And I think as we get into the archives, we'll find that all through the 50s, the United States was hoping that Islamic revivalism would offset communism, and there were instances where it gave support to that. So there's a letter from a Shiite Iranian in Mashhad in the early 50s to the U.S. Embassy saying, you people are encouraging so-and-so mullah, the clergyman who's very right-wing, and this is a big mistake. This man is no friend of the United States or of democracy, and if you keep encouraging these kinds of people, it's going to be very bad for everybody. So I think the overthrow of Mosaddegh did weaken the Communist Party in Iran, but it didn't significantly weaken the religious right, and ultimately it was the religious right that proved a greater danger to U.S. interests in Iran than the communists.
Is there any way that this discussion can help us get a handle on the nuclear project of Iran? Because it seems to me that in the end, what you're suggesting is that even a very conservative regime religiously in Iran will actually be going after what has been a modern technological solution to the problem of ensuring state security, basically, when threatened by, say, global superpowers from outside. So it's not so surprising then that, like every other state that feels threatened, it would aspire to acquire nuclear weapons.
Well, it's worse because the United States actively encouraged countries in the Middle East to develop nuclear power, not nuclear weapons, but nuclear power, back in the 50s when the U.S. was, the nuclear energy was led by the industry was led by the United States, and there were hopes, I think, that U.S. companies could make money abroad and so forth. So there was something called Atoms for Peace that was encouraged by the Eisenhower administration, and the pressure was put on governments in Tehran and Baghdad to have nuclear generators, and it's the origin of a lot of these nuclear programs. Was the American-backed Atoms for Peace. The Shah developed 3 light water reactors at Bushehr. The Shah's ideology, this is the absolute monarch of Iran in the 1960s and 70s, the Shah's ideology was a very modernizing ideology. He would tear down the old bazaars and sort of insist that you put in strip malls instead. And I think he had a rather Philistine view of what modernity was, but the nuclear power plants were certainly symbols for him of Iran's modernity, and he once said that in 20 years Iran would be like France. That was his hope for the country. When Khomeini came to power in 1979, he actually closed down the nuclear energy program. Khomeini, as a Shiite Muslim theologian, felt that nuclear power was evil. And certainly nuclear bombs were evil. It's forbidden in Islam to murder innocents, and it's certainly forbidden in Islam to kill large numbers of civilians in the course of warfare. In medieval Muslim ethical thought about the just war, you have to be chivalrous. You have to tell the enemy you're coming 3 days before you arrive. You have to give them an opportunity to back down, or if they're not Muslims, to convert to Islam. When you fight them, you may not kill women and children who are non-combatants, and so forth. So from a Muslim point of view, from the point of view of Muslim jurisprudence, dropping bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima was clearly evil, and Khomeini said so. And so he tried to close down the nuclear program. But there were people around him, like Akbar Rafsanjani, who, although they were clerics, had a more ambitious point of view on things, and who felt that Iran would need the nuclear program. After Khomeini's death in 1989, they quickly resurrected it. So they checked around, they tried to get Russian help with the generators and so forth. It is not entirely clear that the Iranian regime is working full speed ahead on a nuclear bomb. They certainly are working on nuclear energy. But even if they are trying to get a bomb, the national intelligence estimate that's recently been released suggests that they're a good 10 years away. One could understand if they were trying to get a bomb. After all, Russia has them, and Russia is nearby and has been a traditional imperial power in Iran. Northern Iran has very frequently been dominated by Russia. Pakistan has them, which is just next door. India has them, not so far away. Israel has them, and the Iranian regime views Israel as an enemy. The United States has them on nuclear submarines all around the world, and again, an enemy of Iran. So, and I think the way the Bush administration has approached these matters would, if anything, impel Iran to try to get a nuclear weapon, because there were 3 members of the axis of evil that David Frum put into Bush's mouth, and they are North Korea and Iran and Iraq. We saw what happened to Iraq, which didn't in fact have nuclear weapons and didn't in fact have a nuclear weapons program, but the Americans in Washington seem to have thought that they did. But nothing has happened to North Korea, and it is widely thought that North Korea already has at least some small bombs. If you're an Iranian politician, what lesson do you draw from this experience?
Yes, very clearly the answer is. I want to ask you, I think we can agree that American policy has reflected a total, almost complete ignorance of the insights that might come out of Middle East studies, and that we're now in an unbelievable, messy situation. Do you have any thoughts, drawing on your historical knowledge, on your understanding of the region, about what the course looks like that might get us out of Iraq in a way that doesn't create chaos or an instability that would truly undermine our global interests?
Well, it's a very important question because as of September 11th, we discovered that even a poor developing country like Afghanistan, one of the poorest in Asia, which the U.S. had engaged as an arena for battling the Soviet Union via the Mujahideen, what Reagan called the freedom fighters in the 1980s. Even a country like that can become a base from which the United States is attacked on its homeland. If that's true, then a modern, urbanized, industrialized, relatively literate society like Iraq is a society that certainly could generate far more dangerous threats. So how the United States gets out of Iraq is crucial to the destiny of our nation. There are many who believe that the U.S. should just pick up stakes and get out and sort of do as was done in Vietnam. But in Vietnam, it's quite a different situation. We now know that the communists were near to taking over anyway, and that many of the officers in the South Vietnamese military were in fact double agents and had already gone over to the north, and so forth. And so you had a nationalist movement with an ideological slant which was in position to take over the whole country. And not only did it achieve a certain political stability, but it then was invaded Cambodia and tried to do something about stability there as well, with a horrible price, of course, and loss of individual liberties and so forth. But still, Southeast Asia stabilized itself over time and did not become a threat to the United States. And the domino theory didn't work out very well, and so forth. But I would argue the situation in Iraq is very different. There is no national movement that could hope to unite the country and provide stability, even on an authoritarian basis, in the wake of a U.S. withdrawal. The Kurds in the north, who are 20% of the population, mostly want their own state and have secessionist tendencies. The Shiites in the south would like to keep Iraq together, but they want a greater share of the oil resources that are in their regions, and that desire could itself break up Iraq. The Sunni Arabs have no petroleum at the moment developed in their areas, and so they are threatened with being reduced to being very poor, to being poorer than the Jordanians, and they're very well aware of this. They talk about being left with nothing but the desert dust around Fallujah. And now you have very vital and organized underground militias who are fighting a low-intensity guerrilla war. The only thing that keeps that a low-intensity war and keeps it a guerrilla war is the U.S. presence. Because when I was in Lebanon, I saw these neighborhood militias can form themselves into essentially armies. And then they go out from the neighborhood and they try to conquer territory. They're turf wars, and sometimes they'll go out of the city. So the Palestinian militia went down from West Beirut down to Damour, which was a Christian town sort of behind Muslim lines, and committed a massacre there in January of 1976. The same kinds of things would certainly happen in Iraq if the United States were not there now. And there's danger of this spiraling into a large-scale civil war of the sort we saw in Yugoslavia, in Afghanistan, in Cambodia, or, you know, in some of these conflicts in Afghanistan and Cambodia both, we think about 1 million people died, and this could happen in Iraq very easily. So, and then there's danger that the Iranians and the Saudis would be drawn into supporting one side or the other, and
and the Turks too.
The Turks could come in the north on behalf of the Iraqi Turkmen who are in conflict with the Kurds. So it could become a regional war, and it's very destabilizing to the world to have a regional war in the Middle East of this sort. More especially since 20% of the world's proven, 2/3 of the world's proven petroleum reserves are in the Persian Gulf region, and Saudi Arabia is the world's largest exporter of petroleum, over 7 million barrels a day. So if a regional war broke out over a civil war in Iraq and there was pipeline sabotage on a large scale in the region, it could be a huge disaster for the industrial world. And however much we don't like petroleum, right now our society is running on it, and you don't want to see it interrupted, and you throw the country into deep economic depression. So how we get out of Iraq is extremely important. Of course, there's also a danger that the Sunni Arab areas, which have increasingly turned to revivalist Islamic movements, could become a base for attacks on the United States of an al-Qaeda sort. And there has been talk about that sort of thing, taking revenge for the assault on Fallujah by the Marines by hitting the U.S. And one worries about this in the long term. The Europeans, Jean-Louis Bruguière, one of the great anti-terrorist figures in France, a judge who's dealt with this issue, is convinced that Iraq is becoming an incubator for terrorism in Europe. So the U.S. obviously does have to get back out of Iraq. This thing has gotten very badly awry, and the U.S. ground troops that are there are no longer doing any good in regard to achieving a military or political mission. But I also don't think you can just up and withdraw altogether from Iraq. The one hope is that the Shiites and the Kurds, who have struck a bargain with one another to make a new government, can put together an army, a military that's sufficiently loyal to the new state and sufficiently good at fighting that ultimately it could protect them from the Sunni Arab guerrillas. And I think they're going to need some help with that. I have suggested that we should keep some special ops forces and some air power on their side for as long as they need it. Some people are afraid that making a suggestion like that implies that it means one wants the United States to be in Iraq in the long term. I don't worry about the United States being in Iraq in the long term. The U.S. Can't have bases in countries that don't want it to have bases. And you saw that in the Philippines. I guarantee you that the U.S. Navy wants bases in the Philippines, but they can't have them because the Philippines Parliament asked them to leave. And the day that Grand Ayatollah Sistani gets up in the morning and gives a fatwa that foreign troops should leave Iraq is the day that the withdrawal would begin, and the U.S. would just have nothing to say about that. So I'm sanguine that in making this suggestion that the U.S. find a way to support the building Iraqi military, it's not a recipe for a long-term U.S. military presence in Iraq. I think that cow is out of the barn. I mean, with Abu Ghraib and all of the other scandals, and with the guerrilla war, the U.S. Constant bombing of civilian neighborhoods and cities, the Iraqis don't want the United States there. And the only reason that they're still there is that the Iraqi political leadership that's emerged in the wake of the fall of Saddam is afraid that they'll be taken out and shot if the Americans aren't there to protect them. I think we need to jumpstart the creation of a new Iraqi armored division. Last I knew, the Hungarians are going to give them 77 old T-72 Soviet tanks, which aren't so bad, and which the Iraqis know how to operate. They were supposed to arrive in September, but I haven't heard if they have. And I think the U.S. has dragged its feet on creating an Iraqi armored division because they're a little bit afraid that it might turn on them. So I think the sooner we can start drawing down substantially the U.S. Infantry in Iraq, the U.S. ground troops, I think then there'll be less danger to them of any Iraqi armored division, and there won't be so many reasons to slow its building. And until the Iraqis can operate tanks and helicopter gunships in an effective way, they're going to have no hope of standing against the guerrilla movement. And so I think we need to jumpstart those processes. We need to give them smart support of the sort that we gave the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan. If they need us to put a laser on a guerrilla hideout and take it out, we should do that for them. But to keep 140,000 troops there on the ground has become clearly counterproductive.
One final question, hopefully for a brief answer because our time is running out, but you're the president-elect of the Middle East Studies Association. Do you see a future in which Middle East studies can actually inform our policy and be effective in being an input to a rational policy toward the Middle East?
Well, Middle East studies has all along been important to policymakers. I've met UN officials who recognize my name because they'd done literature searches and found articles that I had written in scholarly journals. State Department people. I've done briefings in Washington in which all kinds of counterterrorism people were there and who had read, either read my blog or had read articles by me. And I'm just giving myself as an example, but of course there are 2,600 academics in the Middle East Studies Association, and they are widely read in policy circles in the State Department and by professionals. I don't think there's a problem with that because the academic field produces organized knowledge about the region of some sophistication. There's a lot of work on Muslim movements and revivalist movements that's important to current policy. And it's open. It's there. Often now it's digitalized in databases. It's freely accessible, and there are many career diplomats and others in places like the State Department that know languages and are steeped in that literature. I think the big problem is that the Bush administration in particular has run foreign policy in a peculiar way. I think there's increasing evidence that Vice President Dick Cheney headed what was called the Iraq Group within the White House, and that these were persons who did not have deep knowledge of the region, but who had a policy they wanted to push, which was a war against Iraq. And I think they therefore not only ignored all of the research that had been done by academics, but they shunted aside the entire State Department and all of the Arabists in it, and actually forbade them, even after the war was over, to go to Iraq to help with the running of the place. So you had a bunch of 20-something kids who had no Arabic trying to run Iraq, and of course the thing was a huge fiasco. But it had nothing to do with the expertise that exists in the U.S. State Department or the military with regard to the Middle East and the interface between those agencies and the literature produced by academics. It had to do with a cabal-like way of running the government.
Juan, I want to regret that I have to end the interview. Our time is up, and I want to thank you very much for being with us today and taking us on this brief tour. And I want to recommend to our audience strongly that this is just a sampling of the breadth of insight that they can find at your blog, which again is Informed Comment or juancole.com. So thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.